stress is often seen in terms of being a stimulus. And however, obviously the response is different for different people and for different reasons, anywhere from genetics to heredity to generational aspects of stress and trauma. And so the key really is how we are able to respond organismically, how our nervous system, how the primitive parts of our nervous system are able to reset themselves when there's been a disturbance, a stressor. So, I would say that trauma basically is intense fear or threat, along with the feeling of being helpless, being in the face of helplessness. I think that's a reasonably good working definition. And it really, again, depends on so many factors, because for the same situation, for 3 different people, for 10 different people are going to have 3 or 10 different responses. But everybody has a breaking point at which our core parts of our nervous system, our bodily experience, doesn't reset, doesn't return to equilibrium. Everybody has a breaking point. Even the most courageous of the Navy SEALs has a breaking point. Usually when people come to that breaking point, the initial symptoms are often just shock and numbness. And then that gives rise to symptoms like being on edge, hypervigilant, always expecting danger, sleep disturbance, nightmares, flashbacks, of course, are the standard, and flashbacks of the event that caused the trauma. However, in my experience in working with trauma for 45 years, is that actually many of the symptoms are what are called negative symptoms. So symptoms like depression and physical symptoms, pain, things like fibromyalgia, irritable bowel, many cases of migraines, and even many cases of asthma. These are all things that the body is experiencing that have to do with being shut down. The initial responses usually are the so-called positive symptoms like flashbacks, hypervigilance, nightmares, and so forth. So, and usually as trauma goes on and it's not resolved in the person, it will tend to go from the positive type symptoms, the PTSD, classical PTSD symptoms, to the more somatic, sometimes called conversion symptoms, somatoform dissociation, sometimes also called that. So sometimes, especially with children, you see children that have been traumatized and they're very, they're a quote disruptive, they're unruly. But then you see the kids who just, they're not there. They're blank, and they're, in both cases, but especially in this case, they're really unable to take in new information, to be able to synthesize new information. So it makes learning extremely challenging. And I understand that a lot of the people that we're talking to are educators. And I think it's really important to notice kids that are not only agitated, but kids that are just shut down and just not there.
Special episode with one of my foundational teachers, the father of somatic experiencing, Dr. Peter Levine. He received his PhD in medical biophysics from the University of California in Berkeley and holds a doctorate in psychology from International University. He's worked in the field of stress and trauma for over 40 years and is the developer, as I mentioned, of the Somatic Experiencing Method. He is the author of the very well-known bestseller, Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma in Multiple Languages, also in an Unspoken Voice, How the Body Releases Trauma and Restores Goodness. And then the latest, Trauma and Memory, Brain and Body in a Search for the Living Past. And I love the second part of it, In Search for the Living Past. Dr. Levine, thank you so much for joining me today on Wise Girl, where we invite people to discover their own inner wise girl or guy, their own inner wisdom. Thank you so much. So I was thinking today, as we look into your body of work, and people can, of course, read more about you, and I'll share your information and websites, but I wanted to really just kind of get to it. This latest book, Trauma and Memory, you're talking about our sort of emotional brain, if you will. Our limbic brain is sometimes called in a triune brain system, which some people have different terminology about. But can we talk a little bit about what explicit memory is? I call it sort of the autobiography, and what limbic memory or emotional memory is, kind of the memoir of our experience, and how this influences us in our lives and relates to trauma.
Well, okay, let me kind of broaden that a little bit.
Yes.
And let's talk some fundamentals of memory, by the way. So anyhow, there are two basic forms of memory: explicit and implicit. Explicit, conscious; implicit, I won't say unconscious, but at a much deeper level. And within each of those main categories, explicit and implicit, there are two subcategories. You have declarative memory and explicit declarative memory, and something that's called autobiographical memory, or they're very different, even those two memories. So declarative memory means I remember that I have to get here, I have to set my computer up and do an interview with you at 10:30 on the 22nd of February. That's all declarative memory. And of course we need it. Otherwise we wouldn't have all of the great modern things that we have without declarative memory. But then there's the thing called episodic memory or autobiographical memory, and that's different. It's sort of remembrances of things from our past. The classic example of this is Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, where he takes his cup of tea and dips in a little pastry, a madeleine, sips the tea, and then he's transported back to the streets in Dublin of his childhood. So this is not something he deliberately recalled. It's something that just kind of happened. Now, we can sometimes reflect on episodic memories. I think, oh, yes, I remember the time in the fifth grade in elementary school, and then I can sort of wander there. So they often occur spontaneously, but they can also be somewhat recalled, not the same way as declarative memory. Now we have the two categories that you're really wanting to talk about, I think, and these are the implicit categories. And the first one is emotional memory, or limbic memory, if you like. But then there's an even deeper form of memory, which is called procedural memory, sometimes called body memories. So the way that emotional memories emerge is that we meet somebody, we're introduced to somebody, and all of a sudden we feel anger or fear. I mean, this is somebody we've never met before. What's that about? Well, that's probably an emotional memory. Something about them, maybe their posture, the way they sit, the way they look, if they have smoke on their breath or something like that, it triggers something from the past. And we have an eruption of this memory. Where did it come from? Now, those things are always there underneath, ready to emerge. And they come sometime at the most inconvenient times. Somebody, that I recently was working with, every time her husband touched her, she would recoil and with fear and anger, tremendous anger. And of course, he didn't know where this anger was coming from. Well, then actually what we're able to do is move to the even lower level of memory, or the more implicit, less conscious form of memory, which are the procedural memories. And these are the things that the body learns. And usually we learn these things, well, in many instances, we learn these memories very quickly. Example, riding a bicycle. You know, you do that with a parent or an older sibling, and they're walking beside you, and then they let you go, and there you are riding the bike for the first time. And as the expression goes, it's something that we never really forget. And also it has to be learned pretty quickly, because you don't have a lot of, it's not like something you read from a book about riding a bike. The book won't do you any good. A book about skiing isn't going to really help you ski. Your body has to experience it, and the body has to learn. So those are procedural memories, but a specific class of procedural memories, and this is really, in a way, the fundamental axis of my book, Trauma and Memory, are the memories that have to do with threat and overwhelming threat, danger, threat, overwhelming threat, and helplessness and shutdown. These are profound global states that the nervous system and the body goes through. And what happens if we've been unsuccessful where we have been threatened and we were overwhelmed? Well, that memory will become long-lasting, sort of in the way that learning a bike becomes long-lasting. These memories, they tend to be indelible, but they're not. But we have to know how to access them. And the way to access those memories, really, and I think the only way to access those memories, is through the body, through sensation. Because sensation is what connects us to motor action. Motor action coupled with other motor actions are what give rise to the procedural memory. So if our body is responding to threat constantly, we have to actually complete this response so that it can clear it. Otherwise it continues to linger. And that's, in a way, one of the fundamentals of somatic experiencing, is how to work with these early imprints, these early procedural memories having to do with threat and danger and threat and mortal threat, mortal danger. So again, it's only through sensation that we can move through these memories and then sequence them, and then in a way put them back in the past where they belong, also with the emotional memories. There's a field now, it's a very interesting field, called reconsolidation theory. And basically when we go from a short-term memory to a long-term memory, there are changes that occur in the synaptic connections between the brain. And so that happens in the synaptic vesicles and then in the dendrites and so forth. So there are molecular as well as morphological anatomical changes when short-term memory gets put into long-term memory. And that garnered a Nobel Prize for Eric Kandel. He's the one who did the seminal research on that. So then fast forward to Joseph Ledoux's laboratory. He's the one who's famous for the term the emotional brain. And so he had a student that wondered what would happen if, when you remember something, you actually then interrupted the consolidation. And Ledoux told his student, well, you're really wasting your time, but go ahead if you want, because you have these morphological changes in the structure and also the molecular changes. So anyhow, to shorten the story, he found that when he was able to do that, he was able to erase the memory and even reinstall another memory. And it had to be done within a certain time of evoking the memory. Now, the key in somatic experiencing titration is that we don't overwhelm the person. We work with the trauma one small piece at a time. I call that titration. That's key. So if we can bring up the emotional memory, or probably also the procedural memory, in a state where the person is regulated enough so that they can experience it, they have enough distance, enough containment, so they can experience it without overwhelm, then you have that opportunity for literally the memory to change, to have a new memory. And again, this is what you see over and over in working with trauma, that it's like the person now has a different memory, where instead of feeling absolutely helplessness and overwhelmed, they felt some power and agency. So, so this, I think, is one of the reasons why when you're working with trauma, it's essential to work not exclusively, but primarily from the bottom up, from the level of sensation, from the level of emotional memory, and then to kind of move into more episodic autobiographical memories.
A concept that is well known in the fields of somatic experiencing. Somatic experiencing. This is the work that was founded by Peter Levine. He is someone that I have had the pleasure of working alongside at master classes. It's one of the things I am trained in, to work with people in my practice and in my group programs. So Peter has done amazing work for the field of trauma recovery and nervous system healing. And the topic that I wanted to talk about is titration. I'm going to say that one more time. Titration. And this is an important topic and principle to understand when we are working with stored traumatic stress, when we're working with adversity and a person who has lived with overwhelm and intense emotion and sensation, even physical sickness for very long. And the concept titration, Peter actually co-opted and took from organic chemistry. So I'm going to define a few of these terms, first from the organic chemistry point of view, and then from his point of view, I'm going to quote a small passage from one of his books. The reason why we need to understand titration is because we need to ensure when we're doing this work that we go slow, that we go drop by drop, bit by bit. We don't want to overwhelm and overload the system more than it already is. And we know by definition that trauma and trauma getting stuck in the body and survival stress staying in the body is occurring when the person, the human being, cannot process and integrate what is occurring to them. Things are either coming too quickly so that they cannot integrate and make sense of what's happening and release that trauma. It also might be happening because these experiences, these bad, scary things happen to us when we were too darn young to know what to do with all the overwhelm and all of the sensation and emotion. And so as adults, as big people, as I like to call us, when we are older, when we are working with this stuff consciously, volitionally, we want to be darn sure that we are not putting more input into the system than what it can handle. Also important to understand that part of healing trauma at this nervous system level, at this body-based somatic level, is feeling the tough stuff. It is feeling the survival energies, the anxieties, the fears, the pains. It is confronting the images in our memory from scary things that happen to us. If we don't reprocess and integrate those things, they stay stuck. But we don't want to overwhelm the system so much that we are trapped in a cycle, in a tornado, if you will, of past memories, past experiences, past sensations, overwhelming things. This is what re-traumatization is. So to work with traumatic experience that's stored in the system, we have to touch into the trauma. We have to feel the survival energies. We have to feel the uncomfortable emotions, but we have to do so in small ways so that we don't overwhelm and essentially put the system into more chaos or shut it down completely so that it disconnects. So definitions, and then again, one from organic chemistry, one from Peter. So this is straight from a textbook. So titration. This concept is from organic chemistry, and it involves slowly adding 1 solution of a known concentration. So we know what that concentration is called, and this is called the titrant. So adding that known solution to a known volume of another solution, but of unknown concentration. So we know one piece of one, but we only know one piece of another. So we're sort of putting, it's like a blind date. We only know a little bit about each, but we're putting them together. So we put them together until the reaction reaches neutralization. So meaning they're mixed together in small doses so they don't overreact and explode. So it's, again, this idea of small bit by bit drops. I mean, I use the example of a blind date or going on a date for the first time. Typically, it's happened, you reach out to the person, you might text them, you might telephone them, you might meet for a coffee, you might meet for a walk, and that's the first titration of getting to know each other. Typically, we don't just go in and marry the person on the first date. That rarely happens. And so we go in bit by bit so that the system can settle, neutralize, etc. So again, that is from pure organic chemistry so that we don't explode and create danger in the labs. Okay, this is a definition now from Peter Levine from his book In an Unspoken Voice, which is subtitled How the Body Releases Trauma and Restores Goodness. And so this was published in 2010. So Peter writes, we use titration to create increasing stability, resilience, and organization in the nervous system. I added those words. Titration is about carefully touching into the smallest drop of survival-based arousal and other difficult sensations to prevent re-traumatization. I use the term titration to denote the gradual, step-by-step process of trauma renegotiation. So again, I think some of the more important words from this paragraph are increasing stability, resilience, and organization. Because again, if we think about the human system that has been traumatized, that is still unhealed from trauma, whether current, recent traumas that are shock-based or early traumas from when we were really young and little to surgical traumas to seeing things that were bad and scary, all of it. We want to create a system that has more organization, that isn't living in this chaos and out of control land. We want to bring it back together. We want to take the pieces and literally remember them back together so that the system knows where it is, what it is, and what is happening internally. Those who are living in a lot of, let's say, post-traumatic stress, in a lot of chronic illness, typically the pieces, the structure is very dysregulated, very disorganized, and very chaotic. And so we want to touch into those underlying, the root layers of survival stress that the system is living with and in little tiny bits so that we can, it's almost like we're bubbling them up to the surface. They've been hidden in the depths of our physiology, in our psyche, in our movement patterns, in our holding in of emotion, holding in of sensation. Even Peter has said in the past that pain is trapped sensation. So in order to heal chronic pain, we need to untrap that sensation. We have to let it out. We have to be aware that it's there. We have to allow ourselves to feel it. If we don't, we will never heal that trapped pain or the suffering or whatever it is that we might be struggling with that feels chaotic internally. So again, to review, this is a very common used concept in the fields of somatic experiencing, the work of Peter Levine. It is also it's becoming used in many other somatic practices. It's the same reason we wouldn't ask someone who has never, at least we hope we wouldn't, who's going to say a yoga class to do 4 hours of yoga in one go and to get them to do a headstand on the first day. Typically that wouldn't happen. I know I sure wouldn't want that to happen. We titrate it. We go step by step. We add little bits of pieces. We rest. We pause. We go home, we let the work process in our body, and then we come back when our system has rested. We don't just do as much as we can in one go in the hopes of, getting to this point of having perfection in that practice. Trauma work, healing trauma, working with the nervous system, working at this neuroplastic level, it takes time. Again, it's not a one-stop shop kind of deal. It's not even a 1 week kind of deal. For many of us, it's not even a 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, 4 month kind of deal. It can take many, many months, even years, to start to unravel and work with the system. I don't say that to scare anyone or to deter them from doing this work. I'm being realistic in knowing, working with the thousands of people I have, what I've seen my colleagues do with their practices, when I've watched Peter work, we need to go slow, we need to be titrated in our work, we need to be smart, and we also have to ensure that the body can process what we were doing. When we process what we are doing, we build foundation, we build solidity. As he said, we reorganize the system back into a more resilient, supple, in control organism that can be healthy and that can be in good regulation. So again, quick review. This is a video on this concept of titration. It really comes down to this importance of doing slow, drop by drop, little tiny pieces of work so that we're not putting more overwhelm in the system. If anything, we're reverse engineering that overwhelm by feeling little tiny bits of it, being with it, feeling it, integrating it, dissolving it, and essentially that is what is healing it.